It all started with good intentions. It was spring, and an important event happened. Jane's sister-in-law Lisa and her boyfriend Roy got engaged, and Jane offered to help with the wedding preparations. Jane had a lot of experience in the wedding industry, having been the manager of a large wedding dress company, so she knew how to help. Naturally, they exchanged phone numbers and started texting, which was completely normal. Everything began to change when it became known that the bride was pregnant. They, of course, knew about this from the very beginning of the engagement, but hid it until her situation became obvious. With his fiancée pregnant, Roy began turning to Jane more often, mainly for advice on their relationship, especially regarding their sex life. At first, she tried to keep the conversation light and friendly, but he continued to ask her for advice as a woman. She tried to explain to him that every woman feels differently about sex during pregnancy, but he complained that Lisa showed no desire, and he began to doubt himself. When he became completely depressed, saying that he was no longer attractive and that their marriage was doomed, she tried to cheer him up. "Don't be stupid. You're a very attractive guy, and I'm sure she still wants you. There's no need to be so hard on yourself," Jane wrote. "You're just saying it because you have to," he replied. "I shouldn't say that. It's true, and it's coming from an aging housewife," she replied. "Now, who's hard on themselves? Can I be honest with you, and you won't be offended?" he asked. "Of course you can tell me everything, you know that," she replied. Several minutes passed before he answered. Jane stared at her phone screen, unaware that she was about to receive a message that would change their relationship forever. "You are not an aging housewife. You are actually very beautiful and desirable," he wrote. She smiled nervously as she read his message. It didn't sound like something he'd just say, so she wondered if he'd accidentally drunk. "Are you drunk?" she answered jokingly. She knew that men were rarely so outspoken without the influence of alcohol or something like that. "Only a little, but mostly sober," he replied. "Well, thanks for the compliment then," she wrote. Without thinking, she sent a reply almost instantly. "You are a very desirable guy too," she wrote. It took her a few seconds to realize that her answer might have been taken the wrong way. Although she did find him attractive, she would never admit it for fear of being misunderstood. She didn't want to give Roy false hope and tried to write a reply that would fix the situation, but he sent the next message too quickly. "Do you think if our situations were different, we could have been together?" he asked. Jane knew she had to be careful with this topic. Roy was in a vulnerable state, and any wrong word could only make the situation worse. Without thinking it through, she automatically replied, "Oh, maybe, although I'm sure you wouldn't want me as a partner." She waited nervously for his answer, glancing at her husband, who was calmly watching TV next to her. "I'm not talking about marriage. I meant it just for fun," he wrote. "I understand, but you can still find someone better for such things," she replied. "Perhaps, but I still want you," he wrote. The last message carried weight with her. She read it over and over again, and each time she realized that he had openly admitted his feelings for her. Inappropriate feelings. "Why do you want me? I'm just a wife and mother. There's nothing special about me," she replied, although she herself was beginning to be interested in the direction in which this conversation was developing. "You are so much more than just a wife and mom. You are beautiful and incredibly sexy. I would worship every inch of your body if I could," he wrote. She swallowed as she read his message over and over again. He was slightly drunk, which relaxed his inhibitions, and he spoke his most honest thoughts. Before she could respond, he continued, "I was thinking about you, to be honest. Your body is so hot. Your beautiful full legs, your delicious ass, and your voluptuous breasts," he wrote. She froze, her curiosity now at its peak. She knew that he was definitely drunk, because in a sober state he would never talk to her like that. However, she was truly interested in how far he was willing to go. Against her better judgment, she replied, "Really? What were you thinking?" she wrote, her hands trembling with nervous excitement. She knew she was entering dangerous territory, but she couldn't help but want to see how far he would go. Up to this point, it had just been harmless flirting, but the situation was clearly heading in a more forbidden direction. "I took a photo of you last time you visited. I'll use it," he wrote. Her face flushed. She didn't want to think about what it could mean, but she knew very well what it was about. "Which photo? Can I see it?" she asked. She just couldn't help herself. A minute later, she received the photo. There was nothing revealing about it. It was just a photo of Jane standing on the patio. She was wearing denim shorts and a light gray top, leaning forward, talking to Lisa. However, taken from a certain angle, the photograph could look seductive to someone who wanted to see something more in it. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a ponytail. She herself did not see anything sexual in this picture. "I don't see anything special about this photo," she wrote. "You don't see what I've seen since I first met you," he replied. "Your body is so sexy." Now she was blushing to the roots of her hair. Their conversation quickly became obscene. She knew she should stop it, but he kept sending messages. "Your feet are so beautiful. I could lick them for hours. Your breasts look so delicious. Your ass makes me so horny." And then it happened. Intimate photo. She froze in shock. Her husband was watching TV next to her on the couch, while his wife stared at a photo of her future son-in-law on her phone screen. She was stunned and confused. She understood that she shouldn't look at it, especially knowing who it was, but her gaze was riveted. It was equally impressive in length and thickness. This was on a completely different level compared to what her husband had. It took her a couple of minutes to answer. "Very impressive," she wrote. She didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell him that she was flattered, but nothing could happen between them. She was about to send this message, but he managed to answer first. "When was the last time you had good sex?" he asked. She had to think. It was a very personal question, and she wished she could tell him so. She wanted to end the conversation. Roy was slightly drunk and said things he would never have dared to say sober. And she, although sober, could not deny that his frankness affected her in an unexpected way. She felt herself starting to get excited. "To be honest, it was a long time ago. Probably many years ago," she replied. She was embarrassed to admit that although she loved her husband more than anything in the world, his performance in bed was practically non-existent. He had erectile dysfunction, so he couldn't get hard for many years. She longed for real sex. "I think we can help each other," he replied. "I don't think this is a good idea. Maybe if the circumstances were different," she wrote. "Why should they be different? It's just sex. No one will know," he replied. And here it is. Now he no longer hinted, did not make assumptions. Roy opened up completely to her. He wanted her, and she fought desperately to admit that while it was flattering, she couldn't let it happen. "I need to think," she replied. As soon as she sent the message, she realized that she had made a mistake. She actually accepted his proposal, and they both understood it. She immediately began typing a text refuting her previous message. She wanted him to know that nothing could happen between them. She was happily married, and he was going to become part of the family and marry Lisa, who, moreover, was carrying their child. She wanted to send this message, but hesitated. Her thoughts were full of contradictions. It had been so many years since someone had spoken to her like that. Roy expressed his deep attraction to her, and it turned her on, the knowledge that despite her age of 40, 2 teenagers, and a loving husband, her body could still turn on other men. Jane deleted the text. Her dark curiosity convinced her to just wait and see what happened next. "See you this weekend," he wrote. The conversation was over for now. She went to take a shower before going to bed, and images of his naked photo popped into her head again. She suddenly realized how excited she was and began to caress herself in the shower. She knew nothing would happen. It was just a moment of weakness that allowed her to even consider it as a possibility. She went to bed, but sleep did not come for hours. Her thoughts continued to spin. Meanwhile, many miles away, Roy was satisfying himself as he had been doing lately, thinking about Jane. He looked at her photo on the phone. He fantasized about making love to her. He imagined what sensation she could give, how she would taste, what sounds she would make when he had her. They were supposed to see each other this weekend for a bachelor and bachelorette party at Lisa's parents' house. Jane felt both nervous and excited that she would have to be in close proximity to Roy. It was a normal event. The women had a bachelorette party in the backyard, while the men gathered in the garage, watching sports and drinking beer. When they arrived, Jane felt slightly uncomfortable as Roy came over to help unload the luggage. He acted as usual, but she was now fully aware that he might have been eyeing her in secret. They made eye contact sometimes, but mostly she tried to keep her distance. She didn't want to tempt him or give him false hope. Shortly before the guests arrived, it turned out that they needed more ice. Roy immediately volunteered to go with him and asked Jane if she wanted to go with him. It would look strange if she refused his invitation in front of everyone. It was quite common for someone to go shopping with company, and refusal would arouse suspicion. She picked up her bag and followed him to the car. She didn't wait long before he made his move. As soon as they pulled away from the house, he put his hand on her knee. Jane was wearing a light blue dress that showed off most of her legs. They drove in silence, only music from the radio playing in the background. His hand remained on her knee for a few minutes before he began stroking her thigh. She said nothing as he continued to caress her thigh. It was only when they stopped at a traffic light that he finally spoke. "Damn, your legs are so soft," he said, squeezing her thigh. When she felt his hand begin to move higher, she took his hand to stop him. "We can't, Roy. Please," she said quietly. He squeezed her soft thigh. Her hand remained on his, not actually stopping him, and he continued to caress her soft, warm thighs. They arrived at the store and parked. Before getting out of the car, he took her hand and pulled her into his lap. "Just touch it a little," he said, keeping her hand on his groin area. She wanted to pull her hand away, but couldn't find the strength to make the right choice. Ever since he confessed his feelings to her, she couldn't stop thinking about it. It haunted her, and despite her initial resistance, she knew deep down that she wanted it too. The moment lasted forever as she held him through the thin fabric of his gym shorts. She couldn't bring herself to look at what she was doing and just stared out the car window. "Oh yeah, that's it, baby," he moaned, leaning back. She knew she had to stop before things went too far. "Come on, let's get some ice," she said, pulling her hand away from his groin. They went into the store and bought ice. Roy took the longer route back home, giving them a little more time in the car. He began stroking her leg again, but now he slid his hand down to her calf and then back up her smooth calves, returning to her thigh. "We'll continue later," he smiled and got out of the car. She remained sitting in the car for a moment, trying to compose herself. She wasn't sure who she was more angry at, Roy for groping her or herself for liking it. The party was in full swing within an hour. Jane was in the backyard, interacting with various family members, drinking wine and enjoying her time. In the garage, the men gathered around the TV and watched the Dodgers play while drinking beer. So far, everything was going well. Roy and her husband became instant friends, discovering that they had much in common, including desire for the same woman. Later that evening, Jane was asked to go get something from the freezer in the garage. When she got there, the men came out into the driveway to talk and show off their cars. She thought she would be alone, but Roy suddenly appeared from the side door of the garage. "We need to get another beer," he said, walking over to the refrigerator where Jane was standing. She opened the freezer on top of the refrigerator and started looking for the ice cream she was asked to get. He crouched behind her, opening the refrigerator for beer. At this point, the garage doors were closed, creating privacy from the rest of the family. As soon as she found the ice cream, she suddenly felt his hands on her legs. First, he slid his hands along her sides, then slowly moved forward, lowering himself down. She continued to stand while he stroked the back of her legs. Suddenly, she felt his lips on the skin behind her knees. He continued to kiss her skin, lifting her calf slightly. She stood motionless as he continued to caress her with his lips. She felt him begin to lightly bite her muscles as his hands moved up her thighs. He turned her around to face him. She panted, looking down at Roy, who was still kneeling in front of her. His hands slid up her hips and cupped her buttocks. He pressed himself against her, his lips touching her skin again, this time through the fabric of her panties. "Oh God, you have to stop," she whispered. His fingers dug into the soft flesh of her buttocks, and he groaned. Suddenly, they heard someone coming from the house and quickly dispersed. Roy grabbed a few beers and walked out into the driveway, while Jane grabbed some ice cream and went back to the backyard. She sat down on a chair and tried to collect her thoughts. Her thoughts were completely contradictory. She knew she had let things go too far, but despite that knowledge, she yearned for more. It was quite obvious that he wanted her so much that he was becoming more and more bold, and her lack of resistance only encouraged him. She knew she had to stop this before things got out of control. While she was sitting and talking to her sister-in-law about the wedding, Roy sent her a message. She quietly looked at the phone screen. "You are so delicious," he wrote. She felt a slight itch in her lower abdomen and tried to ignore it, but she was only fooling herself. His hands and lips really felt good, but she had to be strong and tell him that this couldn't go on. As the evening wore on, everything seemed calm. The men continued to drink beer, and Roy became noticeably more drunk, as did her husband, especially after they started drinking shots. Jane went to check on the men and found them all sitting around a makeshift fire in the driveway. Her husband noticed her and waved for her to sit next to him and Roy. A few minutes later, her husband got up to go to the bathroom, and she was about to take his place, but Roy stopped her and insisted that she sit on his lap. Before she could react, he pulled her down onto his lap. She knew he was a little drunk, so she didn't want to make a scene and just decided to play along with him. No one noticed or paid any attention to the fact that she was sitting on the lap of her future groom. Although she smiled and laughed along with everyone else, she was clearly aware that he was quietly toying with her. He had one arm around her waist and his other hand on her bare knee. As they continued to chat and joke, his hand slid up and down her leg several times, squeezing her thigh. The arm around her waist pulled her closer to him from time to time. Jane could feel the tension in his shorts. A few minutes passed, and she began to worry where her husband had gone. Suddenly, one of their sons came out to report that their father was throwing up. Jane was not surprised. Her husband rarely drank tequila, and it was too much for him. The men simply laughed and turned the music up louder. Jane decided to get up from Roy's lap to check on her husband, but he held her firmly in place. The fire began to die out, and darkness enveloped the group of people. They continued to chat while his hand slowly stroked her leg. No one noticed or paid attention, so she relaxed a little and leaned back against him. At first it seemed normal, but then she felt his hot breath on her neck and knew she had to move away before anything else happened. "I need to go help clean up the backyard," she said quietly, trying to get up. "Stay here with me," he whispered in her ear, squeezing her thigh. "I really have to go," she replied, trying to pull away. At that moment, she felt his lips on her neck. He began to kiss her soft skin, and she looked around in panic at the other men, but no one noticed what was happening, except for one person. Uncle Reuben, Roy's uncle, quietly watched as this beautiful blonde sat on his nephew's lap. He knew that she was married to the bride's brother, but had not yet had time to meet her personally. When he saw Roy caressing her leg, he knew something was going on between them. Jane finally managed to get up from Roy's lap and hurried to the backyard to help with the cleanup. The rest of the night passed without incident. The guests began to go home or go to sleep in the house. Jane went to their guest room, where her husband was fast asleep after drinking. She changed into short shorts and a t-shirt and went to bed. Her thoughts turned back to Roy. Oddly enough, she couldn't stop thinking about how attractive he was, despite how forbidden the situation was. He was so different from her husband. Roy was powerfully built, with muscular arms and chest, while her husband was not as physically strong. Her curiosity about what it might be like with Roy only grew stronger by the minute. About an hour later, Jane felt thirsty and went down to the kitchen to drink water. She was just about to leave the kitchen when Roy appeared at the door. "Hi," he smiled. "Hi," she replied. "I just came for water." She tried to walk past him, but he took her hand and pulled her towards him. "Stop it. We can't do this, I told you," she whispered. The silence in the house weighed on her. "I think you need to see what you're doing to me," he said, pulling her hand towards his groin area. Her mind screamed at her to stop and leave, but her body didn't listen. They stood in the living room, Jane slowly caressing him, and Roy grabbed her waist. His hand slid down under her shorts and grabbed her bare buttock. They were completely immersed in this moment, as if they had forgotten about everyone sleeping above. "Yes, that's it," he hissed. She felt like she was in a trance. Her mind kept repeating that she needed to stop, but her body, drugged with desire, resisted it. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "I can't do this," she answered quietly. "Tomorrow is a new day," he said, holding her close to him. His hands were still caressing her buttocks. Their gazes met for a few moments. She could see the burning desire in his eyes. Jane closed her eyes, waiting for the kiss, her heart beating faster. She knew she wanted this, but she was afraid to admit it even to herself. He approached her lips, breathing into her face, and stopped a few centimeters away. Jane leaned up to kiss him, but he suddenly pulled away. It was a test. He knew that if she really didn't want to go any further, she would have stayed put. But her movement towards his lips was a clear confirmation that she was ready. Roy let her go. "Good night," he said, leaving for the kitchen. She returned to the bedroom, where her husband was snoring loudly. Jane could not fall asleep for a long time. Her thoughts were full of contradictions. In her dreams, Roy continued to appear, passionately taking over her body. She woke up sweating and realized she had to change her panties. There were only a few days left before the wedding, and there were still many things to do. Jane was grateful for the distractions that kept her and Roy apart. However, towards noon the situation became restless again. Lisa and Roy had to go to the event site for some final preparations. At the last minute, they invited Jane to come with them. Her husband was still hungover, so he stayed home. As they were getting into the car, Lisa suddenly sprained her ankle and, not wanting to take any risks, decided to stay home. So Jane ended up alone with Roy. At first, Roy acted normal, as if the last few days had never happened. They chatted about everyday things, and for a moment Jane even thought that she had imagined it all, perhaps under the influence of her imagination or random excitement. But soon she again felt his hand on her knee. Today she wore a light white summer dress because it was very warm, so her legs were exposed again. "You look great today," he said, squeezing her knee lightly. "Thank you," she replied quietly. "You feel even better," he added, slowly starting to stroke her thigh. Jane again felt that she had to gather her will into a fist and explain everything to him as it was. She placed her hand on his to stop his movement and finally spoke. "We need to talk," she said. "Fine. About what?" he answered calmly. "Listen, of course I'm glad that you want to. Play with me, but you need to stop. I am married. You are going to marry my sister-in-law, who is also pregnant. What are you even thinking about? This cannot happen, and you know it very well," she said firmly. "I think you need this as much as I do," he replied calmly, squeezing her thigh again. "What are you saying? Why do you think I need this? I am happily married and have a wonderful family." "I don't need it," she answered, although there were already notes of doubt in her voice. Roy saw right through her bluff. If she really didn't want this, she would have stopped him already. "Then tell me that you have a great sex life. Tell me that your husband satisfies you every time. Tell me you don't want to get really fucked," he replied. "I—" She began to say, but fell silent, realizing that he was right. She needed this just as much as he did. "Just let it happen. This will be our little secret," he said, his hand sliding higher up her thigh. As a sign of her silent consent, she slightly spread her legs. Her thoughts struggled between guilt and burning desire. She knew it was wrong. She knew that she was not only cheating on her husband, but also betraying her entire family. But her body yearned for it. Sighing heavily, she whispered, "Okay." "Well done. That's right," he said with satisfaction. They drove in silence as Roy pulled off the highway and stopped at the Comfort Inn just off the exit. I'll take the number. Wait here, he said, getting out of the car. Jane remained in the car, her hands shaking and her thoughts racing. Her husband wrote her a message, nothing important, just casual correspondence. She was too absorbed in what was happening and quickly replied that she would be back soon. She didn't even realize she was holding her breath until Roy walked out of the office with the room key in his hands. She watched as he approached one of the rooms nearby, opened the door and walked inside, leaving the door ajar. This was the moment of truth. Jane knew that once she got out of the car and went to this number, there would be no turning back. She opened the car door and stood up slowly, her heart pounding. She stood by the car for several seconds, looking at the open door of the room, persuading herself to take the first step. God, you're completely crazy, she muttered to herself, closing the car door and heading towards the hotel. The room was dimly lit through the half-closed curtains on the window. It took a few seconds for her eyes to adjust to the darkness, but she immediately noticed Roy standing at the edge of the bed. She slowly walked towards him, and when the distance between them closed, he reached out, took her hands, and pulled her into his arms. They stood hugging for a few moments. His hands slid along her back, slowly moving lower and lower until he squeezed her buttocks. She rested her head on his chest, her hands gently stroking his muscular back. He hugged her tighter to him. They stood like that for several minutes, their sexual energy growing. The breathing became more and more heavy, their touches became more passionate and greedy. "I've wanted you for so long," he whispered. "I can't believe this is finally going to happen." "I know. It's so wrong, but I want it," she replied. She lifted her head from his chest and looked at him. Her bright blue eyes expressed desperate desire, and Roy knew she was ready. "Take me, Roy. Make me yours," she said quietly. He gently cupped her face in his hands and leaned down to kiss her lips. At first, he only touched them lightly, but she immediately responded to his kiss. The second kiss lasted longer, their lips pressed tightly against each other. He moved to her neck and began kissing and sucking her skin, his hands sliding over her body, squeezing her buttocks, and then up to her chest, and he gently kneaded her breasts. Roy moaned in pleasure as he hungrily kissed and sucked on her neck. Jane's hands slid between them, and she lowered them under the waistband of his shorts. His mouth slid downwards. He hungrily covered her shoulders with kisses before continuing to her breasts. They slowly moved to the edge of the bed, and when Jane felt her behind her, Roy gently laid her down on her back. His hands gently slid along her legs. His dark eyes were riveted on her face. He lifted her right leg and started kissing her soft, smooth skin. "You're so beautiful," he moaned, kissing her calf hungrily. Roy gently slid his fingers over her skin, starting at the tips of her toes and slowly moving up, as if his every gesture was thoughtful and intentional. Jane felt goosebumps run through her body from the touch. It was a feeling that she could not explain, something that was on the line between reality and dream, between what is allowed and what is not allowed. With every movement, the tension in the room grew, as if the air became thicker, saturated with anticipation and mystery. When his fingers reached her thighs, she felt her heart beat faster. At that moment, nothing existed except the two of them, immersed in a quiet, almost sacred moment. Roy was incredibly attentive. His every gesture, every touch reflected the depth of the emotions that they both had been holding back for too long. Their connection grew stronger with every second, and it was impossible not to notice. "Oh, Roy, this is incredible," she breathed, feeling her breath hitch. Closing her eyes, Jane allowed herself to be completely absorbed in the moment. It was not just the pleasure of touching, it was the realization that they were finally where they should have been a long time ago. Everything that happened seemed both natural and exciting, as if every moment had long been predetermined. Roy stopped, looking at her as if he read her thoughts, and in his gaze she saw something more than just desire. It was an understanding, a connection of their souls on a level that would be difficult to describe in words. Jane felt a wave of warmth roll over her body, and this wave captured her completely, leaving no room for doubt. He gently ran his hand over her cheek, and their eyes met. That look held the power of their past hidden memories, secret feelings, and all the things they had hidden from each other that were now surfacing. "You are beautiful," he said quietly. His voice was almost a whisper, but his every word penetrated her heart. Jane couldn't help but smile, and her heart responded to his words as if it were something long desired. Her fingers gently touched his arm, and they intertwined, as if their bodies themselves knew what to do. Their closeness at that moment was not just physical. She touched something deeper, something elusive, but real, their souls, which had long been striving for each other. Roy hugged her, and their lips met again, this time in a kiss that was long, full of passion and unspoken words. It was a kiss that had everything: their desire, their regrets, their dreams and fears. This was the moment when they both realized that everything that happened between them was inevitable. They slowly immersed themselves in this moment, taking their time, realizing that every gesture, every movement was important. When their lips finally parted, Jane opened her eyes and looked at him with a new depth of feeling. All fatigue, all anxiety disappeared. Now she felt light, as if the whole world around her had ceased to exist, leaving the two of them alone. They lay next to each other, and she felt the warmth of his body, heard his breathing, which became even and calm, as if everything around had frozen, giving way to their closeness. She gently ran her hand over his chest, and their fingers intertwined again. They were silent, but no more words were needed. It was all said in their touches, in their looks, in the way their bodies moved in unison. Every moment was filled with tenderness and warmth, as if life itself had given them this moment so that they could enjoy it together. They reluctantly got dressed and left the room to run errands. For the rest of the day, they went about their business. As they drove, he continued to caress her legs, and she reached out and stroked him through his shorts. They both knew that once they got home, they would have to stop playing for a while. She had a hard time concentrating on anything as they sat down to dinner. He couldn't stop thinking about her. He watched her as she paced around the kitchen, her legs bending as she reached for something from the pantry. She felt his gaze on her as she helped hand out dessert. She sat down opposite him and helped herself to some ice cream. He watched as she slid her lips over the top of the popsicle, slowly licking all around. She briefly looked into his eyes and smiled. She knew what he was thinking as he enjoyed the treat. Throughout the evening, she found it difficult not to think about what they had done. It may have only been an hour, but she felt like it was the best hour of sex she'd ever had. She felt herself getting aroused just remembering how incredible their sex had been. It hurt, of course, but it was a very erotic feeling. The taboo nature of it all was just the icing on the cake. She wanted more. He sat with her husband on the patio, drinking beer. He also found it hard not to think about their day at the motel. "Dude, your wife is amazing. She helped me a lot today," he said. "Yes, she is wonderful. I'm glad she can help you guys with all this wedding stuff," her husband replied. "Oh yeah, she definitely helps me a lot. I'm looking forward to spending more time with you guys," he said. But in his mind, he really wanted to tell him how much he was looking forward to spending time with her. Alone time. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Jane and her husband went to bed. She was wearing her usual light gray sleep shorts and a white tank top that she thought might be too tight for her to wear legally, but she liked them and they were comfortable. Her husband had just turned off the phone and rolled over, and a few minutes later she heard him begin to snore. She sighed and continued browsing social media when she suddenly received a message from Roy. "Meet me in the garage," he wrote. She couldn't help but smile. She looked at her sleeping husband and made sure that he was not at home. As soon as she realized that the way was clear, she got out of bed and quietly went down to the garage. The house was quiet around 11 p.m. The only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room and the occasional click of the ice maker in the kitchen. She walked quietly to the garage door. He waited in the almost complete darkness of the garage. The only dim light was a night light set into the wall above the workbench where he stood. No words were spoken as he pulled her into his arms. They kissed each other hungrily, and his hands immediately grabbed her ass. They knew they only had a few minutes, but it was enough to lose themselves in the moment. He gently hugged her, pulling her closer to him, and their bodies moved closer, feeling each other's tension. He whispered her name quietly, running his hands along her back, and she felt the warmth and trembling in his every touch. She turned to him, their eyes met, and there was an instant understanding between them. Her breathing became faster as he gently kissed her neck, and his hands slowly slid down to hold her waist. She felt him pull her towards him, feeling the full force of their closeness. Their connection was quiet, but full of emotion. They didn't say a word, but every gesture and movement conveyed deep affection and passion. He leaned closer, gently kissing her shoulder, as if protecting this moment, and she felt the excitement and warmth that penetrated her deeper and deeper. Together they enjoyed this moment, allowing their feelings to take over them completely. They kissed for a few moments before returning to their rooms. When she returned to bed, her thoughts were full of terrible things. She found herself trying to figure out how to sneak and meet Roy again. She hated herself for feeling so out of control around him, but deep down she knew that this was what she really needed. At 45, she finally felt fulfilled. It was Sunday morning, and they were expected to return home in the late afternoon. Her relatives were a bit religious, so they were adamant about going to church. Her husband surprised everyone by announcing that he wanted to go to church and managed to convince almost everyone else to go. Jane didn't want to go, but didn't want to give anyone the wrong idea, so she told him she was tired and wanted to rest before they went home later. Although it seemed like everyone else was going, Roy refused to go too. He said he needed to go to the auto parts store and change the oil in his car. The truth was that he already had everything he needed for an oil change, but part of his plan was to be alone with Jane while everyone went to church. They planned this at the last minute. They're going to be alone for at least an hour, and they're going to make the most of it. This would be their last chance for a while, as they weren't supposed to return until the wedding weekend. She was upstairs in one of the bedrooms and watched as they pulled out of the driveway and headed towards the church. She felt his hands on her shoulders and then his lips on her neck. His hands slid down her arms, intertwining her fingers with his. He kissed her neck for a few moments before biting her ear. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered in her ear. Their fingers still intertwined, she brought their hands to her chest, and he gently cupped them. After a few moments, she turned and kissed him. It started out as a gentle kiss, but quickly turned passionate and desperate. He led her by the hand to his bed, where he slept with his pregnant bride. He laid her on her back and remained at her feet. He ran his hands up and down her legs, and then leaned down and began kissing her skin. "I'm going to miss them," he moaned, greedily tasting her shins, knees, tops of her legs before moving on to her soft, warm thighs. She felt how he gently slid over her body, running his hands over her skin, as if studying her every curve. Their eyes met, and an indescribable closeness arose between them. He leaned down and kissed her shoulder, and she closed her eyes, enjoying the warmth of his touch. As their hands intertwined, they were immersed in the moment, and it felt like nothing else existed. He pulled her close to him, and she felt his strength, but at the same time, his awe of what was happening between them. They spoke words of love to each other, absorbed in each other, forgetting about everything that surrounded them. His breathing was ragged, but filled with tenderness. She smiled, feeling their hearts beating in unison. In the silence of the room, she caught a glimpse of a photograph on the dresser, a snapshot of Roy and Lisa in a happy moment. This picture transported her thoughts to another reality for a moment, but she again returned to what was happening between them. The thought of how complex and confusing it all was did not leave her, but she pushed it away, enjoying the moment of intimacy. She left the room to go to the kitchen, and he stayed behind to tidy up the bed. When he realized that no one was in the house, he went to the chest of drawers, pushed aside the portrait of them at Disneyland, and took out his phone. He hid it behind the photo so that the phone remained horizontal. He quickly pressed stop on the video recording and began reviewing the footage. He smiled as he ran his eyes over the video of him having sex with Jane on the bed. He knew this video would come in handy on those lonely nights. Later that day, they said goodbye and began the long journey home. After returning home and calming down, her thoughts often returned to the events of the past weekend. The sex was so wild and passionate that it seemed like scenes from a movie. Her life had always lacked such intensity, and now, having tasted it, she wanted even more. They continued to keep in touch, sending messages frequently. Some were quite ordinary, but most were anything but. The wedding was coming up soon, and she wasn't sure how they would be able to arrange it all while attending the event. When the wedding weekend arrived, she barely slept the night before leaving. She often thought about him when she pleasured herself. Even while her husband made love to her, she imagined that it was him and not her husband, although it was difficult because he could not perform like Roy. This left her feeling more sad than happy. Meanwhile, Roy was enjoying his secret video. He would sneak into the bathroom several times a day to satisfy himself by watching Jane ride him on video, crying that she wanted him to give her a baby. On Thursday evening, they arrived at their relative's house. While everyone else was downstairs in the living room, Roy offered to take their bags upstairs to the guest room. "I'll go with you. I need to get something out of my bag," she said. Of course, no one paid attention to this. There was too much to worry about with the final preparations for the wedding, and everyone was busy. He watched her from behind as they walked up the stairs, especially her legs. She wore a light green dress that exposed most of her legs and hugged her curves tightly. As soon as they entered the guest room, they attacked each other. He quickly collapsed on top of her on the bed. They kissed passionately, their hands roaming over each other's bodies. Roy had sex with her fast and hard. It was just a quick fuck. Their lips met in a passionate kiss. Their moans were muffled. Uncle Reuben, an elderly relative of Roy's, filmed the wedding on his phone camera. He recorded the action throughout the venue, which was an intimate Spanish-style venue with a large courtyard for the ceremony and a spacious ballroom for the reception. The bride and her bridesmaids received a separate room for preparation. The living room began to fill with guests, and Reuben simply walked around and recorded various moments. The groom was in his separate room, where he was preparing for the ceremony. Reuben noticed the blonde enter his room. He recognized her as Roy's sister-in-law, whom he had seen at the rehearsal dinner. It was she who sat on Roy's lap during the party when he caressed her. Reuben didn't know why, but he had a suspicion that something was going on between Roy and Jane. He noticed a few little things during dinner, the way they looked at each other, their frequent touching. What struck him most was the way Roy casually stroked her legs as she sat on his lap. It was a very intimate gesture that no one else noticed, but Reuben did. He decided to go behind the changing room and made his way to the half-open bathroom window. Even before he looked inside, he heard the inevitable sounds of sex-heavy breathing mixed with kisses. Peering cautiously through the window, phone in hand, recording what was happening, he saw Roy pinning Jane against the tabletop, her legs wrapped around his waist as he had sex with her. His pants were pulled down to his knees, and their lips met in a passionate kiss. Roy held her hips as her legs continued to wrap around his waist. Reuben noticed how her leg muscles tensed as they continued to have sex. Roy gave her one more deep kiss before she left the room. Reuben stopped the recording and reviewed what he had filmed. The video was surprisingly of good quality and clearly showed the two lovers engrossed in their illicit affair. He smiled as a truly insidious idea popped into his 67-year-old head. After the ceremony, while the wedding party was taking photos, Reuben approached Jane and her husband John, who were standing outside the bar drinking. He introduced himself again and, after a few minutes of small talk, told her husband that his fiancé was looking for him. It was an outright lie, but it was enough to leave Jane alone, and that moment was enough to put his plan into action. "Come on, I want to show you something," he said, smiling, and pulled her aside, away from the others gathered at the bar. He took out his phone and showed her the recorded video. Her eyes immediately widened in shock as she saw Roy having sex with her on the countertop in her groom's room. "I really like the high resolution on my phone, don't you?" he said with a grin. Her eyes were still wide with panic, and she tried to grab the phone from his hand, but it was no use. He quickly put it away. "And not only the video quality, the sound here is also amazing. Although, I'm sure you wouldn't want me to turn up the volume, right?" he added. "What do you want?" she hissed. "Meet me at the toilet in 5 minutes," he said, putting the phone in his pocket. He left just as her husband returned. Jane tried her best to hide her anxiety and ordered another drink. After taking a few long sips of her gin and tonic, she apologized to her husband, saying she was going to the toilet. Reuben was already waiting for her, leaning against the door near the toilets. He was a stocky older man in his 60s with a thick mustache and a friendly smile, which earned him a reputation as everyone's favorite uncle. His wife died several years ago, and he has remained single since then. Roy was half Hispanic, and Reuben was related on that side of the family. When he saw her approach, he opened the door he was leaning on and motioned for her to come inside. It was a small closet, barely big enough to hold the two of them. She already understood what he wanted. He was going to blackmail her in exchange for sex. "Listen, Micah, I caught you in the middle of something hot with Roy," he said. "I guess you don't want anyone else to know about this, right?" His calling her Mija made him even more vile. The way he used the word made her feel extremely uncomfortable. "What do you want?" she asked, already knowing where this was leading. He reached out and pulled her towards him, his hands immediately grabbing her buttocks. "What a sweet ass, Mija. I just want to try it a little," he said, squeezing and pawing at her. Before she could respond, he covered her mouth with his. He pulled away from her lips and moved to her neck. She just stood there as he continued to squeeze her buttocks and kiss her neck. "Yes, I understand why my nephew is interested in you. You are a sweet little thing," he hissed in her ear. He reached down and grabbed her hand, pressing it to his groin. "Get it for me, Mia," he said. She unzipped the zipper and climbed inside. "Give him some love, Mia. I want to feel your sweet lips on me," he said. She knew she had no choice. If she wanted to keep her dark secret, she had to play by his rules, otherwise. She knelt down and gave him pleasure. "We'll see each other often, Mia," he said. "Please don't tell anyone," she begged. "Don't worry. Your secret is safe as long as you never reject me again," he replied. When everything was clear, they left the closet, and she went to the bathroom to freshen up. She looked at herself in the mirror, and her thoughts were spinning chaotically in her head. She admitted to herself that she had enjoyed her little affair with Roy and their arrangement up to this point, but now that his Uncle Reuben had found out and was probably using it to his advantage, she felt uneasy. She returned to her husband's table, trying to act normal. Later that night, Reuben approached her and her husband. He sat down next to Jane at the table and struck up a conversation with the couple. While they were talking, he put his hand on her knee under the table. Continuing the conversation with Jane's husband, his hand slowly slid along her thigh. A few minutes later, he asked John if he could dance with Jane a little. The husband did not even suspect that he was handing his wife over to the hands of a man who had recently forced her to give him pleasure. Not surprisingly, he happily agreed and invited them to enjoy the dance. She looked at her husband one last time as Reuben took her hand and led her to the dance floor. The dance floor was dark and crowded, the perfect place for a 67-year-old man to do whatever he pleased with the much younger Jane. As soon as they reached the far corner of the dance floor, the music changed to the slow composition, "Always and Forever." This was no coincidence. Reuben paid the DJ to specially play an extended version of the song, giving him almost 10 minutes with Jane. He pulled her towards him, placing his hands first on her hips and then quickly moving them to her buttocks. She kept her hands on his shoulders as they moved slowly to the music. From where they were, in the farthest corner of the dance floor, no one would be able to see anything because of the darkness. Soon she felt his lips on her neck, and he began to kiss her. It was dark, the only illumination being the multicolored lights near the DJ booth, mostly blue and purple. He squeezed her buttocks, pulling her towards him. He was breathing heavily as he continued to rub against her. "Mia, you're so beautiful," he whispered in her ear between kisses. She didn't say anything, just stared straight ahead as this man, old enough to be her father, continued to harass her. He had already forced her to please him, and she was terrified of what he was probably planning next. She felt trapped. She couldn't tell anyone for fear that everyone would find out about her affair. She thought about telling Roy, but she was sure that as soon as Reuben found out about it, he would make the tape public. "I have to have you, Mia. Tonight," he whispered. "There's nothing we can do here." She replied, knowing full well that he had probably already planned everything out in his twisted mind. "Meet me in my van in the parking lot after the dance ends. It's parked in an alley. You'll know it when you see it," he said. The dance ended, and she returned to her husband. He was interacting with various family members, so she simply slipped away and headed to the parking lot. She just wanted to get it over with and hoped that once he had lifted his load, he would leave her alone. As she approached the back of the parking lot, she saw a van. These days, the 1977 Chevy van stood out in a lot of modern sedans and crossovers. She almost laughed when she saw the words "Love Machine" on the sides of the van. He had already opened the side door and motioned for her to enter. Before getting into the van, she looked around nervously to make sure no one was nearby. It was a converted van with reclining plush seats that folded down into a decent-sized bed. Reuben has already set it up for his illegal activities. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and he sat next to her. He placed her legs on his lap and started caressing her legs. "What beautiful legs you have, daughter. Thick and strong," he said, continuing to feel her arms up and down. He lifted her right leg towards his face and started kissing her leg. When he reached her hips, he groaned as he greedily devoured her flesh. He laid her on her back and positioned himself next to her, their eyes meeting. He touched her hand gently, and she felt tension arise between them. They remained alone with their feelings, trying not to reveal their inner experiences. Jennifer closed her eyes, imagining another moment, trying to distract herself. He leaned down and touched her cheek, and she sighed quietly, trying to comprehend what was happening. Her heart was beating faster, but she suppressed the feeling, knowing she had to maintain control. His voice was low and intense. "You feel so good, you are so special," he said, drowning out the internal contradictions. Jennifer couldn't help but notice that she felt a little better when he was around. She wrapped her arms around him, seeking the feeling of warmth and security. Their moment did not last long, but it left a mark that seemed incomprehensible. He gave her one last kiss before opening the van door. A few minutes later, she returned to their table and sat down with her children. Her husband soon joined her and stayed with her for the rest of the night. As the end of the wedding approached, her sense of fear grew. She could no longer look her husband in the eyes, feeling how every day her deceitful behavior was destroying their marriage. But it was impossible to retreat. She knew that Reuben would continue to blackmail her, and the discovery of an affair with Roy would deal an irreparable blow to the entire family. Later that evening, as Jane was about to leave the hall with her family, her husband suddenly offered to return and congratulate Roy on his successful wedding. Jane froze. She would have to face Roy again, although every moment of their interaction burned her conscience. When they approached Roy, he smiled at them, hugged John, and thanked him for his help in planning the wedding. But Jane noticed that Roy's gaze became colder. After their last meeting at the hotel, he seemed to have lost interest in her. For him, it was just a game that ended as soon as he got his. This coldness struck her. He was no longer the person she had imagined him to be. Now in front of her, there was only a man who had played enough of his games and moved on to the next one. Her heart sank. It suddenly became clear that everything she had been through was just a result of her own weakness, and that her life would never return to the way it was before. She was silent in the car on the way home. Her husband chatted cheerfully with the children, and she looked out the window, realizing that her life was now just a series of secrets and lies hidden under the facade of a normal family. When they got home, Jane went to the bathroom to wash her face. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, trying to see the woman she was before she got involved in this hell. But all she saw now was a destroyed woman who had lost control of her own life. A few weeks later, she received a message from Reuben. He reminded her of his power over her, but this time he threatened to act harsher if she did not comply. She understood that this could go on forever. Reuben will never let her go as long as he has the power to manipulate her. The day came when Jane could stand it no longer. She realized that her life would never return to the way it was. She did the impossible. She recorded a conversation with Reuben on a tape recorder. His threatening words became proof of his criminal actions. After this, Jane turned to a lawyer, not afraid to reveal her affair with Roy. She knew that the truth hurt, but it was impossible to hide it any longer. A few days later, Reuben was arrested on charges of blackmail and threats. Roy, having learned about this, tried to regain control of the situation, but Jane no longer needed him. She told her husband everything that happened. It was a painful conversation that lasted for hours, but John, although devastated by the betrayal, realized that Jane had been unhappy for a long time. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.